Daniel, do you think the prosecution has more evidence than we've seen? Whoever did this, Brian, or if it somehow happens to be someone else, how did they get out without leaving more evidence? Oh, yeah, I think there's a ton of evidence. You got to work things backwards, right? But before you can work it backwards, an investigation to find, the majority of the evidence, if not all of it, is you got to find out who it is. And when they found out who he was on December 19th, they arrested him just 11 days later. Part of that process was finding him. He was in the Pocono Mountains. They didn't know where he was at. They had to require Colorado license plate readers and the 2 stops from Indiana to determine that he went back home. They had no idea where he went. On December 19th, they thought that when they got his name and they found that he wasn't at his house and they saw a vehicle, white Elantra, crashed in Eugene, Oregon, they suspected that he was out there. That came from the airmail article. They found out that it quickly wasn't it. How would they know unless they had a suspect already that this wasn't the vehicle and they knew that the license plate or the VIN number of the vehicle that was being operated? How would they know that's not the right car that quick? They had their name, they had their suspect, they just didn't know where he was at. They found him. I think they got out there December 23rd or 24th. By the 27th, they're pulling his dad's trash. Well, at least they pulled the trash that had his dad's DNA, that they used. They may have been pulling his trash earlier than that and not finding any DNA or his DNA on the trash. And that could have been what confused them and maybe perhaps kept him out there longer. It took a while. And once they finally got DNA and they said, it was his dad's, they tested it. A lot of people get confused with what's on the PCA as everything. We've seen one Linda Lane footage video. Everybody thinks that video is all the video that police have, and that the actions of that vehicle or the maneuvering of that vehicle was doing during that span between 320 and 420 is all the video that they had to determine that was a white Elantra and that was a suspect vehicle. And that's not the case. Do I think there's more evidence? 100%. There's a lot of warrants that were done after his arrest. A lot of them were for his locations. When it came to Bryan Kohberger, they have him on camera, his vehicle. They have his phone that can put him in his car. He had to say that he was driving around that night because they have his phone putting him in his car. They have him on video in those places. In Pullman and whatnot, before he turned off his phone. He couldn't say he was at home alone or any of those things because they have him there. I know a lot of people are going to say, it's triangulation, 27 miles, the mountains, the valleys, they all mess with that. And you know what? You're accurate. But what doesn't is the GPS that's attached to the phone. And if your phone is on connected to the network, then your phone is on connected to your apps, those apps that you give permission to follow where you're at. So all those times that he was stalking and things like that, that's evidence that's going to be out there. And although they used it in the probable cause affidavit for his arrest to get warrants, to get his actual GPS location and things like that, it's not something that's going to be used in court. What's going to be used in court are those GPS locations because they're going to be accurate down to a foot. And they're going to be able to say, this is exactly where Bryan Kohberger stood for an hour, didn't move. And if it's directly behind the victim's house, that's pretty suspicious. What do we know? We know that the house is clean, right? Everybody says it's clean. There's no blood trail in and out, but there's no DNA on the bodies. There's just DNA on the sheath. It was hard initially for police to determine point of entry because there was no sign of break-in or anything. And it tells you that it's planned. So if somebody's planning something, there's evidence of said planning. Now, a lot of people are going to think, well, there should be notebooks, things on his phone, things like that. But he's had 7 weeks to get rid of those burner devices or notebooks that he may or may not have had. But he would have had to have been watching them. He would have had to have been following them. And if they have his phone and they have their phones and they have their GPS throughout that short period of time, it's not like he was out Pullman, Moscow area very long. It's only a couple of months. They can interact with those and see when they cross paths and see exactly how close he was getting to them. They'll be able to see how, if you've ever entered the building. And since they have everybody's, cell phone data information, they're going to know if he ever went in that house while they weren't there. So there's a lot of things that you can tell just off of that one warrant. That's just off of one warrant. There's so much there. And there's things that I may or may not know. I can't tell you guys that tell me that this thing is solid as hell. There's reasons why they want to go to court already. They want to get this over with. The only thing it's doing is dragging out the victims and their families and, making them wait for justice. Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence we don't know. We probably know about 10% of what they do. I know a lot of people say, hey, probable cause affidavit, it's about 90%, what evidence they had at that time. Well, getting to the arrest portion is usually about half of the work. And when you have a situation where somebody did something like this, where there's hardly any evidence in the front part and you're having to use DNA, well, there's going to be a lot of evidence in the back end. That's for sure. I know some assume Idaho police are corrupted on this, but what are the chances corruption like this would extend to Oregon police, where the wrecked Elantra was found, and the Pennsylvania too, and FBI? Right. I mean, here's the thing. Everybody's looking at Idaho State Police. They're looking at specific officers who may or may not have done something at one point that was wrong. Now, everybody says they framed this guy. They framed this guy. No, he didn't frame anybody. They asked him questions without reading his Miranda rights. And then after he asked for a lawyer, they left the room. He then asked specifically to speak to the chief. And the chief said, you have your right for your lawyer. And he said, I can't afford one. He said he wanted to talk to him. You can rescind your Miranda rights if you want. I haven't deep dove into the case, but from what I understand and from what he's suing the Idaho State Police for, doesn't mean he's innocent. I don't know the details of the case or any of those things. It just means that those officers made a technical mistake. They didn't read him his rights when they should have, and they probably shouldn't have talked to him after he asked, even though by the sounds of it, he rescinded his rights to speak, have a lawyer present. The police don't have to, when somebody goes, I want a lawyer. Okay. They just leave. They don't call lawyers for you and say, hey, this guy's asking for a lawyer. Can you come down and be the police lawyer for the defendant here? Represent him while we question him? That doesn't happen. They say, all right, here's your phone call. Call your lawyer. Oh, you don't have one? All right, well, let's go sit in the jail. Oh, but you want to find out information? Well, you already asked for a lawyer unless you rescind. Are you rescinding? Yeah. All right, let's go see what we know. Let's go help you out. That's how it works. But where they messed up is they flat out told him he was a suspect and then didn't read him his Miranda rights. You can't do that. That's a big no-no. Framing somebody and planting evidence, because that's what framing is. Framing is planting evidence to make it seem like this person is the person that committed this crime. They didn't plant evidence. They asked him questions. I don't know how it is in Idaho, but from what I understand when it comes to Miranda, if you're asking somebody questions that would make somebody believe that that person is the suspect and not a witness, you have to read them their Miranda rights, and them flat out saying, we think you did this, and not reading the Miranda rights is what got the guy off. Now, what do those guys and that Miranda right thing have to do with the FBI, getting his locations and finding out where Bryan Kohberger was? The FBI finding out who Bryan Kohberger was through the IGG, the FBI arresting him with the help of Pennsylvania Police Department, who, by the way, that Pennsylvania Police Department don't have body cameras. None of them. It's a small town where they live in. There's no body cameras. It's not something unusual. It's not like it was something that was specific just for Bryan Kohberger. They decided, hey, we're going to arrest this guy. Everybody turn off your body cameras. They never existed, which is why they said, we can't give you something that doesn't exist. They are literally asking for things that don't exist. So if they're still asking for body cam footage of his arrest, knowing that they don't have body cam cameras, that's another thing that tells me that this case it's weak. I believe he was there. But in Idaho and Montana, you can do this with no signal, seriously, more than 2 hours worth. Very rule. You better get a hold before you leave kind of roads. Right. No, I understand that. But my thing is, in order for his phone to have lost service, which they're going to know, right? They have his phone. They downloaded his history. They're going to know if it lost service and it just was lost in service and it was trying to pick up service. They're going to know. There's a phone document of that. If he turned it off manually, they're going to know. It's going to say phone was turned off manually, right? You can't pull the batteries out on these things anymore. So either he turned it off manually or he put it in Bluetooth. So they're going to know 100% why his phone was off, for one. Two, if it has to do with, service, we would have to believe that his phone lost connection in Pullman, Washington, where service would be the strongest, and drove through Moscow, Idaho, where service also would be the strongest without connecting to a tower, including those that were connected to the towers where the King Road residence occurred, the incident occurred. They have those cell phone tower records. And I would think that if there was some sort of outage there, that it would affect more than just Bryan Kohberger in those areas. And then we'd also have to accept the fact that Bryan Kohberger's phone came back on and stayed on, through the most rural part of Idaho, where you would expect there to be a drop. Based on those parameters, I just find it highly unlikely that he lost signal while he was out there operating his vehicle. And I find it more likely it was intentional. And if it wasn't, something that wasn't intentional, was it the battery dying? Which there will be a report of that, that this phone died, turned off due to battery. The phones will tell you everything. They'll tell you when they're facing forward, sideways, up, down. Somebody looks at it, somebody don't look at it. You say something around a phone. What happens? Go to Facebook, you see it there. So they have all that. They got this guy.